Welcome back to Animal Songs, a story set to music, written and performed by Jamie Holcomb. Interpretations vary. How can that be? What's interesting is that the same people who worship objectivity are always praising the idea of different perspectives. When you disagree with one of those titans, they tell you, well, that's just your perspective. A wise man once told me, all you can do is polish your own lens. Now, what in the world could that mean? All paths lead to the center. The truth is a single point, but the ignorant have multiplied it. I knew those Persians would be good for something. Our old enemy. I'll follow Plotinus. Get myself some of the actual truth. The one, the intellect, the soul. Eliminate one and you'll lose them all. Dialectics. Hippo. The two mothers on board the SS Enterprise, as they had christened their tiny craft, were sisters. The older of the two, the mother of the young girl, was named Crystal, and her white striped dress and matching turban were of an appropriate turquoise, her favorite color. Her daughter, 4 years old and talkative, was named Starla, and Crystal had loved to dress her in yellow when she'd had more than the simple smock dress, patterned with orange sunflowers, which was now her de facto uniform. Crystal's sister was named Ruby. Her dress and turban were the red counterpart to her sister's blue, and in every way the women were opposite. Ruby's newborn boy was named Todd, and she had been changing his diaper when the storm struck. In the chaos, she had neglected to grab him a replacement outfit. The baby was wrapped around the waist in a burlap sack that Mr. Hump had found in the back of the boat, and this garment Ruby frequently cleaned by rinsing it in the passing waves and then drying the salt-fresh diaper on the stern in the streaming sunlight. Peter donated a bundle of cloth so that the goggle-eyed Todd, silent and watchful, looked like the rag boy's disciple, a miniature of the mummy-wrapped lad who proudly played patty cake with his double as the SS Enterprise drifted east. "Just follow the sun, Mr. Hump," Warshaw said. The scholar reclined on the second bench, towards the stern, smoking a cigarette. "Actually, we're following the opposite course," said the fisherman. He gently turned the boat with his left oar and let the current do the work. "My meaning, you understand. From where the sun comes, rather, not where it goes." Aye, the fisherman grumbled. Violet spent most of his time gripping Tangi's hat. He furrowed his brow and muttered to himself, sitting all the way in the stern, with his winged back turned to the rest of the party. "Have faith," said Peter. He clapped a hand on his friend's brittle right wing. "We will see her again." Violet ignored him and gripped the hat more tightly. He flapped his little wing until Peter let go. Crystal and Ruby were not sure what to make of their rescuers. Frida Hump, enamored with their gentleman captain, showed so much admiration for Mr. Warshaw that the sisters were compelled to trust him. Mr. Hump never left the oars unattended, and Peter was a perfect babysitter. He was full of little games he'd once shared with his orphan siblings, and perhaps the two children now in his company allowed him to grieve for those briefly re-encountered comrades who had been lost beneath the waves. The ladies understood these members of the crew, though Warshaw's lethargy caused them to raise their eyebrows and exchange worried looks, and his babble about dragons yielded nervous laughter. The Humps argued quite a bit, and too often the girls saw, after the sun had set, when he thought they had all gone to sleep, Mr. Hump looking frantically over his shoulders and pulling the oars in a wild turn. And Peter seemed to have a delusion that their drowned friend would magically return to life, a belief which he proclaimed with glazed eyes and a dreamy look that yielded those same nervous chuckles from the sisters. Yet what else were the women to do? They had been lucky to catch Mr. Hump as he'd steered past the roof on which they had been stranded. They were alive, and this motley group had at least some idea of where to go in this wide, wild world. The real question that the girls couldn't answer was what should they make of the forlorn monster huddled in the stern, lamenting over a felt hat. "Mommy, what is that?" Starla asked daily. Crystal's response was always, "Hush." She would distract her daughter with the fishing line, and she filled the air with pleasant palaver about their imminent catch. "What kind of fish will he be? How many kinds can you name? What if we caught a great big swordfish? He wouldn't even fit in here." Crystal was sure to offer Violet a sardine when they found one. Though he thanked her softly, he never turned. Crystal thought it would be best for Starla to play with Peter. Ruby, of a different mind, sat in the bow behind the oarsmen, and from this safe vantage point she contemplated her counterpart on the other end of the boat. In the chaos of the storm, one thing which she had remembered to bring, how could she forget it, was her bark-bound sketchbook. Filled with a kind of rough papyrus, the book was covered by strips of pine bark, threaded with leather cords. The front cover was hollow on the inside, and in this compartment the artist stored an assortment of charcoal stubs. Ruby captured their journey in these pages, and her favorite subject was Violet, especially when the sun was setting before his bowed head. Though she could not render the image in color, the chimera's position of solitude and reverence explained everything. Ruby particularly loved to draw his little wings. They were a challenge for her to bring out in detail, using her crude tools, but that only made the work more compelling. "What you got for us today?" Mr. Hump would call over his shoulder. Ruby showed him her scenes of his own imposing back, with the rest of the group seemingly perched on his shoulders, or an image of her niece, wide-eyed and gasping, as she hauled in a big carp. But the images of Violet she kept to herself. She did not know why. "That girl," Warshaw suddenly proclaimed one afternoon. The group had just eaten a fine fish, which Mrs. Hump had prepared with salt water, the fishwife's discovery which rendered the raw meat into a delicacy, a crudité that only the Princess of Piro Bay would normally enjoy. The companions had been sitting in silence, each lost in his or her own thoughts, when Warshaw spoke. "That girl," he said again. He held his right hand over his eyes, contemplating his sun-baked skin. "You know, young man," he let his hand fall and turned his eyes to Peter, who sat next to him on the bench, with young Todd on his lap. "You may not be wrong. Did you notice her pristine upkeep? Shined shoes and clean hair? Where had she come from? Where did she find gumption? To challenge that terror, the old witch, the oldest evil in the world." Starla, just behind Peter, tugged at her mother's dress. "I don't like witches." "Of course not, baby," Crystal said. "They're not real." Warshaw laughed. "Of course not, my dear. Just a story, that's all it is." He turned back to Peter. "She spoke to me of dragons that day. Said she had dreamed one. Can you imagine?" At these words, Violet finally turned around. "You know what's real, Pinocchio? Death. No matter what form it takes, Granny, a flood, everything goes away, and there's nothing you can do about it." He held up the black felt hat and released it into the wind. It flew high, flipped, and landed out a few yards on the thick purple water. Peter and Warshaw jerked upright. "Mr. Hump," called the scholar, "turn us." The current had already carried them twice the distance from the hat in the short time that it took Warshaw to call out his orders. Peter turned around and handed Todd to Crystal. He stood, and without a word to anyone, he dove into the water. The sky was tinting orange as Peter paddled after the hat. The group all leaned towards the stern, watching Peter's flailing limbs as he scrambled for his goal. Ruby smiled to herself in the stern, and she scribbled the sight in her sketchbook. Beside Peter, in her rendering, shoulder to shoulder with the boy in the water, was Violet, her little muse. It was a story about him, she thought, that she had captured in these pages. Day after day, you could flip through scenes of the chimera sulking over his black hat, turned entirely to himself. Now here was everyone turning the same way, all eyes on the distant hat, and Violet was no longer sulking. He was with them. This is how Ruby showed the scene in her sketch. Peter returned quickly, and Mr. Hump and Warshaw each grabbed a bunch of rags and hauled him back into the boat. Peter was panting as he fell against the bench. Everyone crowded around him, including Violet. Peter extended the soaking hat to his friend. "Here," Peter said, "it's yours." Ruby captured the moment in sharp swoops. She would fill in the details later. For now she squinted between her page and her model, this peculiar boy, as he accepted the wet hat and lowered it onto his head, with the sunset haloing the sagging brim. After that, Violet turned his back to the west so that he faced the crew. He did not say too much, and Starla was still overly curious about him while Crystal hushed her questions. Ruby watched him from the bow, behind the oarsman, and occasionally Violet would meet her gaze. He'd look away quickly, and Ruby would smile to herself as she recorded those dark pools and the hoops of wrinkled skin around them, the sullen brow that held those sad eyes. The water was calm most of the time, and the party encountered little trouble along the way. The sun could be scalding, but Mrs. Hump invented a paste of powdered fish bones and kelp that worked as a soothing balm. Her ingenuity begged by the constraints of the situation, the fishwife was a forge of creation, constantly finding new uses for their limited supplies. She discovered how the salt in the water could preserve the fish meat. Using Warshaw's smoking supplies and some dried driftwood, she could make a torch, usually held by Peter, and over this flame, each of the companions could spin a skewer of carp. Eventually, necessity pushed her to find the form of bathroom, and it was this invention of which she was the proudest. From a bundle of rope, Frida fashioned a kind of swing. She strung this weaving over the port side of the bow. At the crucial moment, all the crew members needed to do was strip and lower themselves into the submerged seat. Nature would take care of everything, even their privacy, though the proliferation of air bubbles in some circumstances caused everyone to blush. It was probably this crude invention that truly brought the crew together as a family. It was Pinocchio seen Warshaw who was in the toilet the day that they encountered their first spot of real trouble. The scholar sat submerged from the waist down, with his elbows propped on the gunwale, a cigarette in his left hand. His right hand he tapped against his temple, and his face was scrunched in consternation. "What's eating Warshaw?" Peter said to Violet. They were sitting beside each other with a deck of cards, another lucky artifact provided by the boat, spread on the bench between them. "I will tell you momentarily, if you would be so kind as to be mindful of my dignity," said Warshaw over the gurgling water. Peter turned his attention to the cards. He whispered something, and both boys began to giggle. "If you must pry in," said Warshaw, "I was attempting to recollect." His voice stopped while his mouth hung open, and before anyone could ask the cause of his stupefaction, the boat began to rock. A dark hill rolled out of the ocean, tilting the boat up its steep incline. Mr. Hump gripped the oars. "Frederick," said his wife, "what in heaven sent hell is it?" Warshaw began, but he jerked backwards. The swing rope strained and snapped, and Warshaw and the toilet disappeared below the waves. Shocked, confused beyond explanation, the crew members exchanged terrified stares in silence, like frightened creatures, which is exactly what they were beneath. Everyone was a tiny ape floating on a scrap of wood, lost in a world that was not their own. Not even a fisherman can be at home on the ocean. But it fell to Mr. Hump to make some sort of decision, naturally, as all heads turned to the brusque older man who had gotten them this far. It was Crystal who spoke first. "What do we do?" Mr. Hump pursed his lips and blew his mustaches flapping. "Stay calm," he said. Everyone sat tense against the creaking craft. Far below the waves, Pinocchio Sin Warshaw, pantless and perplexed, was being dragged into deeper and deeper darkness. He looked down to see the cause of his dilemma, but he could only make out a dull shadow. Something enormous had a hold of his right foot. There was pressure there, Pinocchio felt, but not pain. He gasped, exhaling a trail of bubbles. "We've got to do something," Mrs. Hump cried, and she buried her hands in her fingers, which frantically drummed her skull. Peter rocked his rag baby and looked between Crystal, clutching wide-eyed Starla, and Ruby, who held her notebook open on her lap while she rolled a lump of charcoal between her thumb and forefinger. Mr. Hump patted his wife on the back with one hand, and with the other he lamely flattened an oar blade on the water. Naturally, sucked into the vacuum of his silence, all heads turned towards the chimera in the bow. Violet peeked over the edge of the boat at the deep, dark ocean. "I wonder," he said. He flapped his little wings. Then he was standing. "What's it doing?" cried Mrs. Hump. "Don't do anything foolish, boys," said the fisherman. "We need to be reasonable." Violet raised a pink palm to his hat and ran his fingers along the brim. He stamped a thick cow hoof onto the gunwale. "You're already doing that," he said, being reasonable. "I think I should try something different." He popped off the felt hat, and he extended it, God knows why, towards young Starla. "Hold on to my hat," said Violet. Then he stepped onto the bow. He turned to nod at Peter, and the rag boy's emerald eyes were clear and mystical as he smiled back at his companion. Briefly, Violet glanced at the artist in the bow. Then he dove after the trail of air bubbles. Fortune is the mysterious force by which these things are done. She does not make plans, probably, but rather she makes decisions. Choices are made so suddenly, so deliberately. The action is perfectly fitted to the situation as a puddle of water is to a hole in the ground, that the outcome seems ordained, pre-designed. Fortune feels like fate. These are simple words, feelers used by the mind of man to probe the ineffable mystery. Why did Violet leap from the boat that day? Was it because of Warshaw, who he intended to rescue? Was it because of Peter, to whom he owed a swim after the incident with the hat at sea? Was it because of the drowned girl he had failed to save? Or was it maybe thanks to those keen eyes he had noticed watching him from the bow? It was the situation, as with Mrs. Hump's variety of invention, that asked Violet to make a discovery. As he plummeted through the black frigid depths, the unlucky chimera paddled with all his strength. He kicked his now useless hooves, the legs that had been so powerful on land. It was only natural that the struggling creature should try everything at his disposal. He flapped those tiny wings. and Violet flew through the darkness. All along, his useless appendages had been intended for a hidden purpose. They weren't wings at all. Violet swam like a nimble fish after the trail of bubbles bursting from the depths. The fins were enough. Though he could barely make out his sweeping arms in front of him, soon he could see ahead a darker mass in the blackness. He flapped and paddled, and he kicked his hooves together like a defunct fishtail. Somehow, naturally, by destiny, Violet's mismatched pieces came together. He was passing the length of a great fish. Beside him opened one enormous golden eye. Violet balled his right fist and banged that auric symbol. A massive air bubble ejected from the creature's mouth, and with it floated the pale, pantless scholar. Violet caught Warshaw by the arm, and he flew upwards toward the light, dragging his friend behind him. Once Mr. Hump, Peter, Frida, and Crystal had pulled the pair back into the boat, and after Warshaw had caught his breath and replaced his pants, the crew sat in a circle around Violet, seated in the center of the boat, as he recounted his journey to the deep. As he talked, Ruby drew the flying chimera and the monstrous shadow. She circled the heroic boy, with his fist raised to pummel that outline, the golden eye which she depicted as his container. The strange thing, he said, to conclude his story, and he turned to Starla, who still wore the oversized hat, tilted back on her head. Well, it's all strange, I guess. Crystal nudged her daughter. Baby, do you think we should let him have his hat back? At first, Violet refused, saying that it looked better on the little girl, but for some unknown reason, the crew agreed with all their hearts that it was Violet who should wear the dark felt hat. Once again, he accepted. The chimera and the hat belonged together. To say that the rest of their journey passed without incident would be a lie. The sea is perilous, and Puro Bay is a distant shore from the wasteland, the town, the river, and the woods. The truth is that I don't really know all the details of their adventure. I can only piece together what I have heard from other sources. What I would like to describe in the meantime is the process that was taking place back on the side of the sea our heroes had left behind. A forest was growing. Far beneath the waves, the forgotten town was pickling in the salty sea. Gases made them buoyant, those people, the horde of green-eyed children, whose memory mystic-gazing Peter kept to himself as he played with his newfound sibling, and the turban-headed women and the burly mustached men. Physics made them stable. Their heavy boots and jewelry secured them to the ocean floor. Together, the forces of nature puppeteered those unfortunate people towards the disintegrating doors of their preserved plaster homes. As the SS Enterprise rode eastward, in the world left behind, the bodies emerged like oysters from their shells. They walked through the cobblestone streets of the forgotten town. Lighter forms, Peter's brothers and sisters, floated and were carried, together with the seeds and cones of the sunken trees, to drift farther west, where each body would bear a tree from its mouth. In the wasteland, a forest grew, while beneath the waters, the marionette corpses performed their magic dance. Drip, drip, drip. Peter awoke from this dream. It was night, and the sky was brilliant with sparkling stars. They seemed to glint with every color. Peter scanned the sky to find the moon, nearly full and so silver. His heart swelled and his eyes began to tremble. Then his gaze turned, and he sat upright. Across from him, oars in her hands, baby on her lap, sat Ruby. The humps were snoring in the bow behind her. When she noticed Peter, she quickly wiped her eyes and sniffled. I didn't know you rode, said Peter. Ruby forced a laugh as she lowered her hands from her face. The moon hung behind her head, and her hair was loose. Todd held her turban. She had golden-hued chestnut locks that glistened in the moonlight, Peter noticed. He turned away from her to glance down at the black water before looking back at the moonlit Ruby. Sometimes I give him a break, she said, and she nodded over her shoulder towards the slumbering oarsman. And this one is up every hour. Todd chewed his fist and stared at the scintillating night sky. Thank you for your help with him. Honestly, he helps me, ma'am. Ruby laughed and covered her mouth, glancing at the sleeping companions behind Peter. Ruby is fine, sir. Were you crying, Ruby? She tilted her head to the side and hid her eyes. It's better to not talk about it. It's good to look ahead. We've had so much to worry about. Peter did not share his dream. I understand. I think about them sometimes. Your friends? Your friend? Oh, I'm not worried about her. Ruby's eyes narrowed as she exhaled loudly. Moving on and making peace with the past is what I'm trying to do. We lived in a house a good way from the river, which was always a bad thing, to live uphill. When it started, the storm, we, like everyone, thought. And then it kept falling. We were lucky to be uphill. I let him go that night. He said he'd Well, he thought when the water started seeping in that he could patch it up. We had a shed out back. He was going to be back with some wood to patch it up. Anyway, we weren't so happy together. Peter said, "I'm sorry." Ruby laughed. "I'm telling you to feel sad, Peter, not to make me feel better. I do. I feel you don't understand. This adventure hasn't been exactly straightforward. I thought I was done for at the start. Here I am. What I feel for her, our friend, I just can't shake it. I can't feel sad because I feel something else." The sense Peter kindled, that his heart kept stoked, was hope, though he couldn't call it by that name. The word is just a simple tool, as I mentioned. These sounds probe distant horizons, realms that maybe we can understand but not experience, or experience but not understand. Simply put, Peter felt in that tiny craft floating on the vast ocean. Ruby remembered, and she chided Peter for looking in the wrong direction. In the glow of the filling moon, with the waves lapping against the boat like a heartbeat, Ruby and Peter talked through the night. They giggled, and though they covered their mouths to suppress the sound, it was a laugh, Ruby specifically, that roused Violet. Curled in the stern, his chosen position, Violet tilted back his hat and cracked an eye to take in the scene. Peter bent forward, cooing to the gurgling, happy child, who was not at all terrified of his green-eyed, fully human mentor, while Ruby beamed, her loose chestnut locks flowing in the breeze, glistening gold in the starlight. The sullen chimera shut his eyes, but he did not go back to sleep. Until the first burst of sunlight shone across the sea, Violet listened to the happy family, and he cursed himself with terrible wishes. Who knows why? This has been Animal Songs, written and performed by Jamie Holcomb, produced by Supermoon. Find us on TikTok, YouTube, or at our website, gosupermoon.com. That's GOSUPERMOON.com. You can also find our work alongside many other talented artists at looksees.com. That's LOOK-SEES.com. This concludes the Hippo chapter. I wonder what spirit we will meet next. Until then, thank you for listening.